Coming up. So I was delighted to learn that Maxine Waters has a challenger, an African-American Republican who seems particularly well-positioned to defeat this Congresswoman who's been in Congress for nearly 30 years. The challenger's name is Joe Collins. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's start with something outside of my typical opening commentary. Let's start with a discussion. But before we do that, let me ask you, which Democrat elected official have you found to be the most distasteful, frustrating, and at times even obnoxious? So I know that many of you would probably say Nancy Pelosi, and depending on her latest rants, I might say so as well. But at other times, I'd probably say Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And you know the reason. The statement from Maxine Waters that stands out as stark evidence of the extent of the breakdown of politics in America. You remember her rant about confronting members of the Trump administration in public. Quote, "Let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere." Close quote. She went on, quote, "For these members of his cabinet who remain and try to defend, they're not going to be able to go to a restaurant. They're not going to be able to stop at a gas station. They're not going to be able to shop at a department store. The people are going to turn on them. They're going to protest. They're going to absolutely harass them." Close quote. This was occurring in the month after President Trump's then press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, was refused service by the owner of a restaurant in Virginia. And a couple of months later, Senator Ted Cruz and his wife were forced out of a D.C. restaurant by screaming protesters. Maxine Waters' statements amounted to an attempt to prevent members of the Trump administration cabinet from living their lives. It was an attempt to force them to resign and to prevent others from being willing to serve in the cabinet. Even Nancy Pelosi attacked the statements as inappropriate. So when I look at the nationally known political figures in office, who I'd most like to see no longer in office, who I'd most like to see defeated at the ballot box, Congresswoman Maxine Waters is always at or near the top of that list. And I was delighted to learn that Maxine Waters has a challenger, an African-American Republican who seems particularly well-positioned to defeat this Congresswoman who's been in Congress for nearly 30 years. The challenger's name is Joe Collins, and I spoke with him at the American Priorities Conference, or AmpFest, in Miami just a couple of days ago. I was impressed, and I think you'll be as well. This discussion was at the conference, not in the studio, so the sound is going to be a bit different from what you're used to. Here's what Joe Collins had to say. So I'm here with Joe Collins. He's running for Congress in the 43rd Congressional District in California. So I know that the Political Spirits listeners from California are going to be interested, but when you find out who Joe is running against, I think every Political Spirits listener in the country is going to be interested. Joe is running against Maxine Waters, and from everything I hear, he has an excellent shot at defeating her. So Joe, thank you very much for sitting down for an interview here on Political Spirits.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an honor. Thank you.
So one of the things that I find most compelling about your candidacy is your background. Could you tell us a little bit about where you come from and where you've been professionally?
Yeah, so I'm from South Central Los Angeles originally. I grew up on 104th and Normandy. Gang violence and domestic violence was something that we grew up with. It was in the community. It was a norm for us. After our house was shot up in a drive-by, we moved to Texas. My mother had enough. I started getting involved in gangs, and she didn't like it. I graduated high school in 2003. I joined the Navy in 2004. I served 13 and a half years in the U.S. Navy. I worked on the E-6 Mercury. I worked on the F-18 Super Hornet, and I worked on the MH-60 Seahawk. I did a boots on the ground tour in Iraq in 2008 in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was a sexual assault and rape victim advocate and a certified licensed financial planner.
Wow.
Yep, I got out the military in 2017 to legitimately get involved in politics. That's the reason why I got out the military.
All right. Mm-hmm. And you were a non-commissioned officer, not
Yes.
a straight line officer.
Uh-huh.
And I think what interests me so much about that is it really fits perfectly with and sends a message with the direction that the Republican Party is trying to move, trying to reach out to not just the wealthiest individuals in the country, to reach out to everyone, to the working class in particular, to try to address the disparities within the country and the difficulties encountered by the working class. Do you think that your background fits well with that, or do you think there's a conflict there, or how do you feel about that?
I would say this: if the Republican Party wanted to have an avenue to reach out to people from inner cities, black and brown communities, people who are not of the wealthiest class, then I will be an avenue. But if that's the message that they want to preach, then they need to say it instead of not saying it. It's absolutely important that we have people from all walks of life involved in the Republican Party. Balance is key for anything. But along with reaching out, you have to support the people. Support these people from inner cities. And where I grew up, we didn't have a Republican presence. I became a Republican on my own cognizance because for me, the history of the Republican Party, the history of black people getting involved in politics was through the Republican Party.
That's
and
true.
That's what resonated with me. But the stereotypes, the ideologies of the Republican Party, they can have it. Some things I like and some things that I don't like, but at the end of the day, if the Republican Party is all about freedom, then I should have the freedom to think however I want to.
That's great. That's great. When did you become a Republican?
In 2004.
2004. All right.
That's when I was eligible to vote.
Okay. Right at the first. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So you mentioned outreach of the Republican Party into the black community. Didn't you participate recently in a very large sort of joint outreach effort? What was that, and how did that go?
Well, I'm always in the community participating in all type of outreach. I mean, I run the majority of the outreach programs for the Republican Party in inner cities because the fact of the matter is, it's not too many people who are establishment Republicans who are confident or comfortable going into a black community. It's scared. Even when we put our office in South Central Los Angeles, they said, well, we're not coming there because it's dangerous. Well, your opinion of danger is different from my opinion of danger. I've actually been to Iraq. Hostility is not dangerous. Hostility is a lack of understanding, a lack of communication or miscommunication. And that's not dangerous. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right? And so the outreach in black communities, we've done it with our food pantries. We do it 3 or 4 times a week throughout the city. Our back to school drives, our backpack drives, our voter registration drives, even from employing people on our campaign. We have over 73 people that works for us, and they consist of black people, brown people, white people, Asians. We have Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Constitutionalists, Green Party, Freedom and Peace, American Independents. We have everybody on our team.
And I noticed that the 43rd District is a majority Hispanic district now.
It is.
Are there any positions that you've taken or approaches to groups that you've taken that resonate particularly well within the Hispanic community? Is it more, are the issues pretty much the same across the board? What
I like to do is I like to engage each individual ethnicity that live in my community. I want to find out what they want. I want to find out what they're expecting from the people who they would like to represent them. And what we do is, in a collaborative effort, we formulate a plan to improve those particular communities. Like the Latino community, DACA was a huge issue. The reason why DACA was broken, they were supposed to create a pathway to citizenship or green card holders through DACA, but it didn't happen. Now that the idea of repealing DACA is on the table, you have a lot of people who are in limbo. They have been promised something. And so what I want to do is fulfill that promise that the U.S. government gave to these people. And that's through making that program solve and creating that pathway that they're looking for. And just like the black community, the issues with gang violence and police brutality, that's an issue with legislation and not bringing opportunities back. So when I talk to the black community, I find out what they want to create a plan on a collaborative effort. Just like with the white and Asian community, find out what their issues are, small businesses, and so we create a plan. The education, we create a plan.
You know, it's interesting, the sort of the fundamental theme of the Political Spirits podcast is that the left and the right need to have a few drinks and talk. No need to compromise, we just need to talk. So I think we really are we have the same position on that. We need to talk to each other. And if you go in saying, well, you have to retreat from your position, you're not going to be able to reach a resolution. If you go in saying, I want to hear what the other side thinks, you're at least opening up that discussion. I think that's what you're saying, is if you open up that discussion, you will find a way to reach a resolution. We have to talk.
That's what I do.
All right.
And a lot of people who consider themselves Republican don't like it. Well, you got to preach the President Trump message. Like, you got to preach a Republican message. And my thing is, well, what if they don't like it?
All right.
What if they have their own issues? So like you said, we have to meet in the middle, find some common ground. One of the most fascinating things about the race we've been running in is the abundance of ignorance, and that's from both sides. Yeah. Right? The left doesn't want to hear the right doesn't want to hear the left, because everybody has been programmed to believe that there is a psychological warfare going on, and the psychological warfare comes from the lack of understanding and lack of paying attention, and just a lack of concerted effort into seeing what's really going on, understanding each other, right? It's not a us versus them, a Democrats versus Republican, because everybody is struggling. It's a, what can we do to meet in the middle to provide opportunities and increase the value and the quality of life for the people who live in our communities?
So that level of conflict that's happening between the left and the right out there, there's one thing I could point to that's very, very relevant to you that I think is an example of that. I looked at your background and I was uniformly impressed, and I am from a military family. Your opponent, Maxine Waters, took a different approach, didn't she? And I think you've ended up filing a lawsuit because of it. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, she ran $1 million worth of advertisement, lying and claiming that I was dishonorably discharged. And the reason why she did that was because I did file a lawsuit against the military. When I got out the military, I was homeless, and I was living on the streets, and I was trying to get my VA benefits. I was going to Maxine Waters' office as a representative. It shouldn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, but I was met with no answer. I filled out job applications, internships, I offered to help, I brought her flowers, but I didn't get anything back from her. And so I sued the military, got my benefits. The case was dismissed because my benefits came through. Right. And she used the defense from the U.S. Navy, which say, he was dishonorably discharged, which was false, right? Look at my DD-214, it doesn't say that. To push her narrative that I was dishonorably discharged, to dissuade voters from liking me. It backfired tremendously, and we ended up filing a lawsuit.
Where is that? It's in discovery right now?
Yep, we filed 2 weeks ago, and we go to court next week. All right. And I mean, just the level of ignorance that comes with running against my opponent is beyond me. I'm completely baffled. We ran into her 2 days ago, and the same thing that we sued her for, we even sent her a cease and desist letter. She was handing out the same exact thing. Well, he was dishonorably discharged. It's like, lady, you gotta stop. Wow. Because people are getting turned off by it. But that tells me one thing. One, I'm actually winning this race. And two, if Maxine Waters actually had done something productive for our community, she wouldn't be doing it. She wouldn't be trying to attack Joe Collins, who is not even in politics. If I was someone who is Maxine Waters, who's been in Congress for 29 years, State Assembly for 17 years, I would definitely run off my accomplishments with a positive message of let's continue to fight what we've been fighting for. But that's not what she's doing.
So what, if you look at Maxine Waters' background, is there anything in it that stands out as an actual achievement?
Yes, absolutely.
What are her positive achievements?
So the one positive achievement that I can think of, and this is by pure speculation, Maxine Waters was one of the first pioneers to create an avenue for black and brown people to get in politics. Okay. Right? And I appreciate that. All right. And, but the manner of how she expresses her message is not ideal, and it's not helpful to our country or to our community. I can't think of any positive thing that Maxine Waters has said, thinking about her career from the time I've been conscious enough to understand what's going on.
Well, the thing that I certainly remember, and I think most Republicans remember, is her public statement that basically members of the Trump administration shouldn't be able to eat in public, go to a gas station without being, encountered, shouted down, run away, so that they basically can't participate in their lives.
Yeah.
And I found that deeply disturbing, and it is, once again, sort of the opposite of the political spirits message. I think what you're saying is it's the opposite of your message as well.
Absolutely. We don't need to harass anybody.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest issues that we have in South LA right now. They listen to Maxine Waters and they take everything that she says as if it's facts, and then they actually try to pursue this message because they don't hear anything else, right? The 92 riots, she incited the 92 riots, which destroyed the majority of all of South LA. She promised to rebuild it, hasn't rebuilt it. The riots in Watts, the same exact thing. It's been back-to-back instances where Maxine has enticed violence. She's enticed racism.
Wow.
And I can understand why. She's old, 82 years old. She lived in a post-Jim Crow era. So this is all she knows.
Yeah.
Which is why it's important that we win this election and remove her from office, because we're not in a Jim Crow era anymore. We are in, I would like to call it the Reconstruction era, where we are rebuilding our community on the values that matter most to the American people. And racism and slavery are not it. Reform and Reconstruction is it.
So you mentioned her age. What is your polling showing you about how you're doing with Gen Z?
With Gen Z, you know what? We hire them on our team.
All right.
Everybody. We have a really good group of people on our team. Our polls show us winning by a large margin. Of course, her poll shows us at 50-50. Other polls that I've seen or people told me about have us 3 to 5 points ahead.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm looking forward to election night. I will definitely be watching the results from the 43rd District in California. Joe, it's been great talking to you. I really appreciate it. And hopefully, if you win, and I hope you do win, you'll give me a chance for an even more in-depth interview afterwards.
Absolutely. You have all our information. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you, Joe. It's been
Thank
great.
you.
So, Joe, one thing I didn't give you an opportunity to do is to mention your website so that people can find out more about your campaign and the issues you stand for.
Yes, please go to my website, joecollinsforcongress.com. That's joecollinsforcongress.com. Volunteer, donate. It's absolutely important that everybody get involved so we can remove Maxine Waters from office.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you.
Well, I loved learning about Joe Collins, and I wish him the best in his campaign against Maxine Waters. Now on to the next topic. Brief Thoughts Ray Ampfest Conference. As I mentioned, I spoke with Joe Collins at the American Priorities Conference, or AmpFest, in Miami. I want to give you a couple of thoughts about the skewed perception that's often portrayed regarding attendees at such conferences. If you only paid attention to what mainstream media sources like CNN and MSNBC and the major networks and the major newspapers had to say about them, you'd assume that everybody at every one of these conferences is either rich, a country bumpkin who worships President Trump, a white supremacist, or a gun-toting anti-government extremist. So what did I find? I found the same thing that I've found every time I've attended a Trump rally, and that is that the press doesn't know what they're talking about, and I'm not sure they even care. They have a narrative, and they're going to run with it, period. Were there rich people at the conference? Absolutely. Did it appear that they were an overwhelming presence at the conference? No, not at all. Now, you can't judge the wealth of an individual simply by their appearance, and I certainly didn't have the time to talk to all of the attendees, but I came away with the impression that there were some very well-heeled people in attendance and a lot of ordinary Americans just particularly interested in politics. I saw plenty of people very supportive of President Trump. But people who talk about them worshiping President Trump are showing their own bias. President Obama had an extremely devoted base, but you didn't see the media criticizing them as worshiping President Obama. In fact, given the number of obviously practicing Christians at the AmpFest conference, they would vigorously fight the idea that they worship President Trump, or any president for that matter. The prominence of Christianity at the conference is one of the things that does stand out. I'm not talking about crosses on the walls. There weren't any. What I'm talking about is the applause which references to Christianity by speakers consistently receive, whether in the form of personal references to transforming their own lives or in references to the country having lost its direction as it's moved away from its connection to Christianity and stressing the need for it to move back. That focus, that presence does draw a sharp contrast with most Democrat conferences. Have you ever seen a celebration of or even a positive depiction of or positive references to Christianity at the Democrat National Convention? Not likely. And that does tend to highlight the extent of the broadening gap between the parties in America. Finally, what about the media view that such conferences are filled with gun-toting anti-government extremists? I didn't see anybody that fit that category, but I did hear applause, significant applause, whenever the Second Amendment was mentioned by a speaker. There can be no doubt that there are huge numbers of supporters of gun rights in America, and I happen to be one of them. For years, I've heard Democrat friends contend that it's political contributions from the NRA that gives it its power. Just attend a conservative political conference, especially one like AmpFest, which isn't limited to Chamber of Commerce Republican types, and you'll realize that the power of the NRA doesn't come from political contributions. It comes from the absolute dedication of its members to protecting the Second Amendment through their votes and their grassroots efforts. It's not money, it's people. And on that note, let's move to the next topic. Rasmussen scare. If you've been listening to this podcast, you know that I believe Donald Trump is going to win re-election. I can tell you that ever since the economy surged after his election in 2016, I've believed that will be the case. For quite some time, I was even confident that he would win by a larger electoral margin than he did in 2016. But COVID has changed that. As I've noted before, the issues that we've been dealing with since the arrival of COVID-19 are so severe, especially the economic impact of the lockdowns in response to COVID, that nobody can really confidently predict the outcome of the election. The combination of the extreme issues we're looking at, the bias of many polls, as demonstrated by their imbalanced samples, and the likely but unknown scale of so-called shy Trump voters make it impossible to confidently predict the outcome of this election. But I have continued to be cautiously optimistic that Trump will win. This past week, though, my confidence was shaken. Rasmussen Reports was the second most accurate poll in 2016. It has consistently been more favorable to President Trump than almost all other polls. So it was with shock and disappointment that I read the recent Rasmussen poll showing President Trump 12 points behind Joe Biden. Now, I know that's a national poll, and what really matters is the swing state polls, because the Electoral College vote isn't based on the national popular vote results. But a national poll can give you some idea of where a candidate stands. Donald Trump won the Electoral College vote in 2016, but he lost the popular vote by more than 2%. It's reasonable to believe that the same thing could happen again, but you can only take that so far. You can still win the Electoral College if you lost the popular vote by more than 2%. President Obama did such an effective job of focusing on swing states in 2012 that he could have lost the popular vote by up to 5% and still defeated Mitt Romney in the Electoral College. And that's the sort of rough, practical limitation that exists. You can lose the popular vote by up to 5%, roughly, and still win the Electoral College. If the Rasmussen poll is correct, and at this point Donald Trump really is behind Joe Biden by 12%, it's hard to believe that shy Trump voters who either refused to respond or responded incorrectly would skew that poll a minimum of 7% to bring it down to the point where you would have a shot at winning the Electoral College even though you lost the popular vote. So is Trump doomed? No, not at all. But what really worries me is that the Rasmussen results may indicate that seniors are leaving Trump. He absolutely cannot afford to have that happen. I'm going to be watching the Rasmussen poll as it comes out regularly, and I'll report back to you. I should mention that there are positive developments, though. The level of intensity and support of Trump supporters in events around the country, whether Trump convoys on the interstate or city streets in Ohio or Miami, for example, or boat parades or street corner gatherings, continues to dwarf that of Biden events. There have been polls that actually asked and confirmed that Trump supporters are more nervous about stating their support of Trump to pollsters and others, and that those who are the farthest to the left are the least reluctant to do so. That certainly would seem to indicate that the polls are understating Trump's support. But I'll keep examining the polls and other evidence of movement in the electorate, and I'll keep you advised. As always, every week. Please join me for the next episode and tell your friends to do so as well. And like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.